All right, let's kick off. Welcome to Cloud Dialogues episode. I don't know. I think we're up to 11 now. So we've hit 10 and now we're on 11. So almost 6 months ago we started. Today's topic is security. So security seems to be hard. Is it actually hard? Or doesn't it get enough priority by key business leaders? Today we have a special guest with us who might be able to provide some answers, if not tips to answers maybe. Welcome Sarah Young, who is a senior cloud security advocate at Microsoft and regular fixture at conferences. Fixture, I'm not sure. That's a cool. I was thinking of the word to use. And I thought fixture was cool.
Fixture will do.
And
like a chaise lounge, Sarah.
I know, just there.
And
Yeah.
out and she's in the regular in the community as well. Always, at all the events, talking to people. So welcome, Sarah. Yay!
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's all right. And well, tell us. So, I mean, security is hard, right? Is it hard or is it not hard? What do you think? What's the answer to that question from your perspective?
So I would say there's not even one answer to that question, to be honest with you. So the thing is, security, the principles of security are actually quite easy, I would say. And in that they're simple to understand. Security is a lot of common sense. Things like we say, principle of least privilege. Let's take something that's been around forever. That things should not have access to things they don't need to have access to. So, everyone shouldn't have God mode in your environment to be able to do whatever they want because most people don't need it. And if they have it, they might mess up and do something. Or if their account is compromised, then you've just given the attackers the keys to the castle. But in practice, actually implementing that security is much more difficult in real life. So I think there's kind of two answers to that. And the problem we have is that security, of course, competes with other business priorities. And that's where it starts to get many shades of gray.
Yes, that's actually a good
I feel
point.
I feel like it's similar to like cloud. Like in theory, cloud is easy, right? Like when you look at your transformation plans, you're like, oh, this is going to be a piece of cake. Well, I mean, I know now, but like but actual execution, highly complex.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a good point because security's always been hard, even when it's been a challenge in the data center. And now when you tack cloud onto it, it's actually quite a bit different,
It's
right?
more
Because
dynamic.
your
Like a
implementation
moving
is
target.
different and how you do things is different. Is it different?
Yes and no. Okay, yes and no. I'm going to give you, maybe I'll just be giving you yes and no answers for everything. But I mean, again, at those high level principles, exactly the same. You're still trying to get to the same sort of goals. And at a high level, at a very high level, how we do that is, and what we're trying to get to, the kind of state we're trying to get to, still exactly the same. Now with cloud, sometimes some of those things change. So how we get there. So, and the main difference with cloud is that because you're not building from the ground up, you don't have your own data center. You are, whichever cloud provider you choose to use, you effectively hand off, and it depends exactly what services you're using, but you hand off a portion of that security responsibility to somebody else, a Microsoft or whoever. So that means essentially you're putting trust in a third party, which in the very traditional sense is something that security don't like to do. Now, because cloud's been around a while now, I think most folks, security folks, have got their head around the fact that everyone's using cloud and you're going to relinquish some of that responsibility to a cloud provider. But in the early days of cloud adoption, I know a lot of security folks were like, no. It needs to stay in our data center. It can only be secured there. There's no way we can go and put it in someone else's data center. So things
Still
change.
today, Sarah.
Yeah, well, I know still today sometimes, but I feel like we're getting better. Like I think the new one is AI. Now everyone's saying no to that instead. So, but I expect exactly.
Same behaviors.
Yeah, but I expect exactly the same thing. A knee-jerk security person reaction is to go, "Oh, that sounds new and different. Let's not do that." because security. Now, the problem with that, and this is a problem that security professionals have had more than anything, is that we've just said no, and that restricts or stops innovation and businesses getting on with what they want to do. And what people have done is gone round security instead and ignored them or done it on the side, which is actually worse. And I think we're getting better now at security being understanding that they are just a function of a business, because security people sometimes have a very inflated sense of self-importance, and they're like, you can't do this because security, and that's all you need to know, when in fact security is just a portion of a business. It's a function of a business. And if that organization, well, business or organization, so an organization has a mission, and their mission isn't to keep things secure. Usually it is to make money or whatever it is, and security is just supposed to help that. So security people need sometimes taking down a peg or two to remember that they are just a function of a business, and they're not there to stop things. They're there to reduce risk. And I think we're starting to get much better at that. But traditionally, of course, that wasn't the way. Security just used to say no. And people in organizations and other parts of IT have often had bad experiences with security, which means they don't come and have conversations with us, or may not come and have a conversation with us, which is a real shame. And that's something that we in security have to work to fix, that relationship.
Yeah. That's a good point. And most of the cloud providers, or all the cloud providers, have this concept called a shared responsibility model, right?
They
And
do.
and I think that tries to help explain, the responsibilities between, the cloud provider and what you as a customer have to provide. Do you want to just give a quick high level view on that and why it's important?
Yeah. So shared responsibility is important for anyone consuming cloud more generally, but in specific security terms, it tells you, if you consume this particular service, these are the things that we as the cloud provider take care of for you from a security perspective. And these are the things you have to do as the end user. Because in the early days of cloud, and I know you'll say to me, this is still a thing, which I know it is in some places, we used to have two extremes when people would start using cloud for security. They'd either want to control absolutely everything and be like, hey, I need to check your data center. I want to check everything, which of course is not possible. We couldn't have, as a cloud provider, you can't have everybody go around your data center. It just doesn't really work. Or you'd have folks at the other end of the scale, like the two extremes, saying, oh, well, it's in the cloud, so now it's the cloud provider's problem. I don't have to do anything. And of course, neither of those are true. We actually sit somewhere in the middle. And obviously, it couldn't be that simple. It depends on the type of service you're using. So if you're using infrastructure as a service, there's generally more responsibility on the customer. If you go to platform as a service, I'd say it's roughly about half and half. And if it's software as a service, more will be being done by your cloud provider. But it's always going to vary a little bit. And so one of the bits of due diligence you need to do when you start consuming a new service, and even a similar service on a different cloud provider, if you move from one to another, is you need to be clear on who is doing what in security terms. Because of course, if there's a gap, then you could have a security gap, and you don't want that. You want somebody doing all the controls end to end. And so it is an extra piece that you need to think of when you're doing cloud. But the good news is, and again, I think people are getting their heads around this. More people get their heads around this than 5-10 years ago, that running big data centers and running platforms, generally a large scale cloud provider will do that better than you. Because we just have more, resources, more people, and we scale it up. Because of course, the traditional mindset was, well, how do we know they can do it as good as us? And it's like, well, we probably can, without, we don't want to, no offense, but we can probably do it better because we're probably just a bit bigger and better resource. But again, it's a change in mindset. It's a shift in mindset that has happened over time. So, and we're going all through it again. And when we get a wave of new technology, we'll go through it all again as people need to get familiar. Yeah.
I, as a partner to one of the big cloud providers, I have discussions with customers sometimes, and they're like, "Oh, our cloud provider is certified in, to a certain security standard. We don't have to worry about that." They still do have to work. They still have to worry about their part.
For real.
Now,
Yeah, I've had those discussions
Yeah.
before.
I have too. Now, that's one of those. Oh, so you're right. So cloud providers do get certified, and we're all certified up the wazoo, to be honest with you, because
That's right.
that's we all have to be. And again, it doesn't matter which cloud provider you're talking about. Pretty much, we've all got the same. We've all got the big industry, the global ones, the region specific ones. Pretty much, all the big players have all the certificates. But that only certifies the platforms that we have built. It doesn't certify whatever you build on top. And I think the problem we have with this is that in the early days of cloud, I think we're a bit better now, but in the early days of cloud, you would get, and I saw this myself in my consulting career pre-Microsoft, you would get a random person who would build something on a cloud provider, like, and it would be like one man and his dog building this service. And then they'd say, I'm ISO 27001 certified. And they weren't. It was the platform they had built on. And
Oh,
and
wow.
and they'd be like, yeah, we're certified. And I was doing security reviews of these services. And so we'd say to them, okay, so where's your ISO 27001 certificate? And they'd be like, don't have one. And we'd be like, you know that you can't really claim that when it's not you, it's not you are not certified. The cloud provider is certified. But I think a lot of people, maybe less so nowadays, but in the early days of cloud, a lot of folks did that. And so it's I'm not saying they intentionally misled, because I think a lot of them didn't understand, in fairness to them. Don't think it was intentional, but I think as long as you see the word ISO or NIST or HIPAA or SOX or whatever, they just be like, oh great, I don't have to do anything. And of course that's not the case. So it probably an education piece and a maturity piece. I think I'm seeing less of that nowadays. I think people understand that a cloud, just because you've put something on top of a cloud that's certified doesn't mean the end-to-end system is certified. But there's probably still a little ways to go there as well, to be honest with you.
And I think at recent events, like, every day there seems to be a data breach, right? And I think that that just shows how important cloud security is to businesses, because they can see the fallout from those data breaches and what impact it can have on them. It can get, expensive
You would
very
think, right?
Oh
fast
yeah.
and
Yeah.
embarrassing.
You would think.
And
Yeah, yeah.
and they're only the ones that you hear about. I mean, there are many, many, many breaches that never ever hit the press. I mean, I know just from like my personal contacts, I've had businesses, friends who are not in security or in IT at all, and they said, "Oh, my business or my kid's school. I've heard my kid's school got hit by a cyber
Worst,
attack
yeah.
and things like that." And one of the most, because the majority of bad actors out there generally want to make money. There are some other types, but the vast majority, if we take them as a whole, generally are looking to make money. So one of the big ones, of course, is ransomware, because ransomware, if you get ransomware, you can recover from that without paying the ransom. But in order to do that, you need to have really, really good frequent backups that are well protected.
Yeah.
Because now also ransomware malware will actually look for backups as well to try and take them out. So you need to have them very, very well sealed off. So if you get ransomware in your system, it's not going to encrypt your backups.
Hmm.
Because if you do have a full backup, you can restore it without paying the ransom. The fact is, I mean, look, how many organizations do backups well? Not many. That's kind of
Interesting. I feel like it's happening more, and it seems like there's more requests to do it as like a managed service. I'm hearing about that more, which I think is like a positive step. And like as you say, like they want it a completely separate, maybe even a separate vendor running
Yeah.
this for them.
I-
which I think is positive.
Yeah, I mean it's obviously like everything we do in security is like risk based. So we always say, you've got to look at your when there's a threat, you look at the impact and the likelihood. So what is the likelihood of this happening, and what is the impact?
Really
So
important.
and
Yeah.
and because the answer is not the same for every organization, and this is why security is hard. So we can say, oh, ransomware. The way to avoid, I mean, obviously you want to try and stop the ransomware from happening in the first place and getting into your system.
Mhm.
But if it does, the way to recover is to have good backups. And then you can just clear out your system, like do an eviction, clear everything away and restore the system. I mean, don't get me wrong. I make that sound simple. That's still not a simple job. But at least you're not in a position where you don't have the data, and the only way to maybe get the data back is to pay these people, because you don't know you're getting it back if you pay either. That's the thing. It's not like they guarantee it. So it's not like, and there's not like a consumer place you can go to complain if they don't do it.
Back up.
I want my money
exactly.
Pay the
Yeah.
answer.
Exactly. So
Oh, dear.
yeah, and so I mean, I think generally they actually do, but then also you often will get your name, your organization, will get you've got a target on your head, because then they know you've paid up, and the sad thing is that a lot of businesses do pay up because they have no
I can
choice.
imagine.
Because if you think
Yeah.
how valuable an organization's data is, if that's your only hope, even if you don't know they're going to pay it back. And I will say at this point, Microsoft's official advice is do not pay. But I can understand why people do, because if
Yeah.
that's your whole life, your whole organization,
Yeah.
particularly smaller
everything you work for.
organizations. Yeah.
Totally.
There's an amazing story from a few years ago. Do you remember, this is one of my favorite stories, I have to tell it. Do you remember WannaCry from
So
2017?
long ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was really interesting, and it went round, everything very quickly. Now there was and this is like I said, it's a public story. So Maersk, the shipping company, they got hit by WannaCry, and it went round all their domain controllers and took out everything. However, and they obviously, taking out your domain controllers is not good, right? That's the core structure of your of your IT
Organization, yeah.
environment. It's not good, and they were struggling to find a way to recover all of this stuff. And so, but the way they did it was they were incredibly lucky. So they had a domain controller somewhere in Africa, because it's a global company. And that African domain controller had been taken offline just before this went through the system because of a power cut. So
Oh,
it didn't, so it didn't get hit with the WannaCry stuff. And therefore, they actually restored everything from this domain controller that went offline because of a power cut. And that was incredibly lucky, like so lucky. But that is not a recommended way to recover from things, right? And if it
It's not a process.
that is
Risk
not a
control.
process. So sometimes sometimes it's a bit of good luck like that. Good luck, very bizarre good luck that saves
Wow.
organizations. But
Yeah.
and this is why security is difficult, because the answers to how to fix things, at least in technical terms, are quite black and white often. We can protect against we have layers of defense in depth, and the idea with having defense in depth is you have multiple different layers. So if one fails, there's something else. And it's only if
Yeah.
all of them fail, something bad happens. And of course, the likelihood of all of them failing is less, but it's not impossible because nothing's 100%. But of course, putting in security controls and more layers of protection costs money. So then you have to look at the threat, how likely it is, and is it worth it for your organization to actually pay for all of that, because security costs money. And this is why security is difficult, because it's not always the same answer for every organization either. So some organizations will say, look, that if that happens, it'll cost us $1 million, and it's not very likely to happen.
The
But
risk.
but if we put in controls to reduce the likelihood of that happening, it's going to cost us $10 million. And we would rather just, because it's not very likely, we'll just accept the risk and see what happens. So I think that's where, because security, the answers to what we do is probably more straightforward, but the nuance and whether it's worth it for an organization is the difference. And there's no cookie cutter, so that's where it's really interesting.
Architecting is always a series of trade-offs, right? And security is one of those trade-offs.
100%.
On the topic of ransomware, the one that I can think of was MGM Resorts back, last year. And they paid, according to reports, they actually paid.
Yeah,
Wow.
I mean, and I'm not sure allegedly they
Allegedly,
paid up.
yeah.
It went, and then it went very quiet, so I'm not really sure. But yeah, sometimes it depends, right? Because I think most organizations, although some governments are starting to bring in mandatory breach reporting, right?
Yeah.
So, but and I think that will become more prevalent, but if you're in a jurisdiction where there is no mandatory breach reporting, most organizations are not going to advertise they've been breached if they can get away with it. Now, something like a casino, when all your machines have been ransomware, it's a bit
That's a
obvious,
bit
but
hard.
it's a
Exactly.
bit hard to hide that one. But it really depends because, of course, no organization wants the public to know that that's happened to them because it's reputational damage as well. And I mean, it's worse for some companies than others. Like, say you're a bank, of course, you don't want people to think you've been breached or something. But what's sad about that, though, but I don't have an answer to this, is that what we really need to do with breaches is, and it does happen in the background in certain sort of closed forums, but is share the details of what happened with a breach so that we can, because if we share, then we can learn and then we can uplift like everybody's security posture. But the sharing is not, at least at the moment, probably as widespread as ideally I reckon it should. But that's again a reputational thing. So
people, and the things the breaches that are in the news, especially the ones in Australia that have made big news, the cause is always relatively straightforward and simple. A lot of the
yeah,
time, not always, but a lot of the time,
that
in
you
hindsight.
also that's a reputational thing as well, though. You often hear that organizations will say this was a very sophisticated breach, and
Super,
also
as it was a magical breach that we could not have
they say,
predicted.
"Oh, this was very sophisticated." Now, the thing is, I guess, like again, from a PR perspective, makes sense. But not they aren't always. I'm going to say that's always the line that pretty much everyone comes out with in public, but we know that that's not always the case. But of course, the majority of the general public would not be able to have a look at the details and would understand. So,
Yeah.
not to say there aren't sophisticated breaches out there. There are, but no one's ever going to come out and say, "Oh yeah, this was like really easy." Yeah.
It's
Oh, this was
always
a
hard.
really easy. Yeah, this was a really easy breach. Oops. No one's going to say that. So, and so I think that's why as well. Sometimes, and this is a challenge we have. There's a general perception in the wider public, but even in other bits of IT, that all security breaches are very, very complicated. And there's someone, with a hoodie on going tap, 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 and who spent like hours and hours doing this very complicated breach. When in fact, the majority of breaches at least start very straightforward with very straightforward things being manipulated. So we call that low hanging fruit. And all the research shows, Microsoft and other organizations, we do loads of research on this every year. And it shows that like 95 to 98% of breaches would be avoided if some what we call security hygiene had been followed. So that's like complete basics, like using multi-factor authentication, keeping things up to date, using some more modern threat detection, anti-malware, making sure principle of least privilege, things aren't overprivileged. All of these things are not new concepts, but people don't do them well, and they're kind of boring. Let's be honest; like they're boring and they're monotonous, and it's not in human nature is to go use the new shiny tool. Whereas, in fact, like I said, the solid research shows that those kind of basic things done right will always protect you better. Because it's all well and good saying I'm going to get, I don't know, my shiny new firewall or AI, because it's the
The
thing at the
AI
moment.
firewall.
My AI enabled firewall, yeah. But if you're not patching, or if you've just got every user as like a global admin or domain, domain admin, whatever, like an attacker gets into that, it's game over. They're not going to spend hours doing something really complicated like model poisoning and some of these new attacks that have been thrown around when they can do something that will take them 5 minutes. So, and I think that's a perspective that people don't keep in perspective, is that attackers are not super proud of their craft. They're not going to do an artisan, beautiful, super complicated attack that's going to take them days when they can pop your domain admin in an hour. So, and I think we forget that.
I guess one of the ways to highlight security in organizations is their culture and, how they do things, how they implement things, and how they think about things when they're putting in new systems. Do you have any tips on how organizations
Mm.
can spread a security culture throughout their people?
Yeah. It's a tricky one, right? Because we actually say because people are a huge aspect of security, right? And they're by far and away the hardest things to deal with rather than technical controls because people don't always behave the same
People are
way. And
dynamic.
yeah, people are dynamic. They don't behave the same way. And it's interesting because security awareness, of course, I think pretty much every organization does some kind of security awareness. But now we also know that if you do too much of that, people get bored and they switch off. And so we're like trying to tread a line between security awareness, people caring, but not getting them bored of it. And if you haven't had a security culture, it can be really challenging to like start one. I mean, I really think it's cheesy, but it really needs to come from top down because I think if you have some leadership that want to enable it and want to sort of bring it more to the forefront, I think that's really important. And it's also important for security folks who are trying to do this or maybe trying to do this to keep in mind that security will never win out over other business priorities. Developers are trying to build things. They're creative. Whereas security are more kind of we not like to analyze things. So we've got competing priorities, but we're still trying to ultimately get to the same thing. But I think, not to stereotype, but us IT folks are not usually the best at emotional intelligence and sometimes communicating. And I think that's where the disconnect has been. So as I was saying earlier, you can't just go in there and wag your finger and say you can't do this because security. And it's more about that kind of collaborative piece as well. And also security, there's a bit of everything here. Security, you have to let go a bit and trust people to do the right thing with the right tools. And the devs and other parts of IT kind of need to step up a little bit and take a little bit more responsibility. Not loads, because certainly we can't expect, it's not realistic, although security has expected this in the past, for other parts of IT to do security at the expense of the rest of their productivity and the other things they're trying to do. That is completely unrealistic. And I think we're getting better at this in security now, like understanding that we need to make the right thing to do the easy thing, or the right thing to do by security, the easy thing to do. And then generally folks will do it.
Yeah.
But you can't turn to a dev and say, I don't want you to do that way that's going to take you 5 minutes. Do it this way that's going to take you 5 days. It's not happening. Like, it's not happening. The good news is with like new cloud services, and I know I'm throwing it AI tooling and stuff, but with things like copilots, etc., the good thing is that some of that monotony and the stuff that was taking a long time, modern security tooling has become much more conscious of like not getting in the way of productivity. It's maybe in the last sort of 4 or 5 years. So what I would always encourage folks to do is have a look at modern security tooling that has been built with folks being much more cognizant of the fact that it can't reduce, it can't make people's jobs take longer. And I think we've still got a ways to go, of course, but it's so much better. It's really taken a leap in the last sort of 4 or 5 years.
And I feel like there's a level of with cloud as opposed to like in on-premise world. Obviously, as we move on to, there's more of a DevOps style of work, right? Which means that when you look at your DevOps pipeline, okay, we're aware of X, Y, Z vulnerabilities, right? Whereas in the old world, we always had vulnerabilities, but we probably weren't as like forthcoming at it, right? It's like, oh yeah, we've had the same vulnerabilities for the last like years since we deployed this application. So I feel like it's almost like a level of cognitive dissonance when it comes to security. It's to like, well, we had problems before. We'll continue to have vulnerabilities that we're aware of, but it's now more about understanding and being aware of what are those risks every time we deployed.
Exactly. And it might be, like I was saying before, it might be, again, but if you've made that decision as a business, that's different to just leaving it and ignoring it and going blindly. If a business decides, hey, this is a risk, but, for whatever reason, money, whatever, we're not going to address it. We're just going to accept it as it is. At least that's been made as like a conscious decision rather than it just sitting there and nobody even knows. I think that's the difference, because accepting a risk or a security issue is a completely acceptable thing to do as long as you've gone through that process of, is it worth our while fixing this? Yes, no. What is the risk to the business? Yeah, exactly. And that's actually something that people new in security forget as well. And I'm guilty of this too when I was earlier in my career, is that you're like, I must fix everything. And that's also not realistic. It's not possible. It's not possible. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough money and time. And I like to use the analogy because I think this is a really good one to illustrate the we must fix everything, or the kind of the ridiculousness of it. So if you look at a different industry like aviation, so in fact, what they do, and I have a whole talk on this. I'm going to say on one of my talks that I do, I've got a whole talk on this. And in the aviation industry, they actually go through an almost identical process in terms of identifying risks and reducing risks in terms of safety. It's safety rather than security. But it's essentially exactly the same process they go through, which is, is this risk acceptable? How do we reduce it? And they have multiple layers. So generally, when you see, and obviously we hope it doesn't happen, a horrible plane accident, if you actually look at accident reports, there are multiple layers of things that have gone wrong. It's not just like one thing that makes a plane crash. Like there's multiple things. And it's when a number of those things go wrong that something bad happens. And that's the idea, right? That very rarely do all of these things line up and go wrong together. And that's exactly what we do in security. But here's what I say to people. I'm like, think about this, right? When some people are like, oh, we can't do that. That's too risky. We need to reduce the risk to zero. Our security has to be 100%. And I'm sure at some point you've heard some exec or someone throw out some kind of ridiculous statement like that. Like, this must be 100%. Let's look at aviation, right? So, of course, if aviation goes wrong, people can die. But it's a little bit more abstracted. But, I mean, you could argue that was security too, say if it was medical devices. But it's a little bit more direct in airlines. So every time a plane takes off, there is a teeny tiny risk that all of those safety things will fail altogether. And then something bad happens and people would die. But the only way an airline could ever reduce the risk to zero of a plane not crashing is for a plane to never take off, which is ridiculous, right? So if you say, oh, we can't have any risk, we can't have any security risk, you're essentially saying, I don't want the business to do anything. Like, I mean, yeah. And like, again, you say that with a plane, obviously that's ridiculous. Airlines couldn't exist if they didn't put the planes in the air at some point. And I think with security folks, as I said, we're getting better than we were historically, definitely. But risk always exists. It's just bringing risk down to an acceptable level with security controls, whether it's technical, people, etc. And when you chuck cloud into the mix, it's just a case. What that does mean is a lot of tooling is much more modern and more better integrated as well. And you've also just got to make sure you assess, we say trust but verify, the security controls that your cloud provider is doing. So it's slightly different, but what you're trying to get to is exactly the same. I do a technical job, but I swear to goodness, I spend more time talking about people's feelings. But much more time talking about people's feelings than technical stuff sometimes, because it's more the culture, people's preconceived ideas.
I feel like that's how you know you're doing a good job, though, Sarah.
Yeah.
If you spend most of your time worried about people's feelings, that's in essence that will what drive the behavior.
Yeah,
right?
It is. Security is way more people centric than I think most than people realize. When you start working in security, you totally get it. But I think from the outside, most people just imagine it is just firewalls, MFA, etc. And of course, and hackers. But in fact, there's so much of it is much more around people's attitudes to things and behaviors, and there's a whole bit of that we probably doesn't get as much press, I think, but it's actually a really huge bit of it, part of it.
Cool. I think you've answered the questions, Sarah. We've run out of time.
That's okay.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And
great having you.
Thank
you.
And the usual thing to our listeners, if you have feedback, send us an email, feedback@cloud-dialogues.com, or the form on our website. So,
Sarah, is there some way that everyone can find your content?
You can just go on X and socials. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on X at _Sarah Yo, which is SARAHYO. Most of my stuff is, if you go on LinkedIn and X.
I refuse to call it that.
I know. I usually don't. The artist formerly known as Twitter then you can find most of my stuff on there. I could say of note recently, I did a GitHub repo, which is like basic security 101 concepts. So we're also there's loads of stuff. My job is to pump out content. So that's probably my one at the moment that I like. So if anyone wants sort of a really easy few hours reading on some introductions to very basic security concepts, like I was talking about these different controls and layers and risk and impact and likelihood, it's probably worth having a look at. It's super easy. It's free. It's on GitHub. It's open source. So star it, clone it, do whatever you want with it. I don't mind.
Cool.
And it's
Thanks
not Microsoft centric. So it's all agnostic.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
See you all next time.
Bye.